Thank you very much, Madam Chair, for the kind introduction, and good evening or good afternoon or good morning to my colleagues and friends from around the world. Yes, having listened to the other panelists as well, without any doubt, we can say that the COVID crisis has exposed many of the fault lines that existed prior to the pandemic's appearance, and it laid bare some sobering truths about our world. While the full impact of the pandemic is still emerging, we are already witnessing its immediate disproportionate impact on the most vulnerable: children, youth, women, older persons, and persons with disabilities. The pandemic has highlighted the need for policymakers to consider how it interacts with population dynamics and its implications for socioeconomic well-being, and in the long run for the demographic dividend. I'm deliberately highlighting the demographic dividend because this is a lens through which many developing countries look into the future. As part of our efforts to reimagine the well-being of vulnerable groups in the new normal, the South African government and the UNFPA hosted a webinar series on demography and COVID-19 in Africa late last year. We sought and secured the participation of many other African governments and from academics and civil society organizations from across the continent. Through the webinar series, we sought to remind ourselves that the SDGs can only be achieved by investing in our young people in a meaningful way, i.e. through education and training, jobs and health, including sexual and reproductive health and rights. What we learned from each other during the webinar series was that the pandemic had amplified the challenges to the youth and threatened the African continent's prospects of harnessing the demographic dividend. Although many governments have taken an array of prevention and response measures against the virus, these measures have had disruptive implications for the health sector, education and training, and job opportunities. Women and youth were and still are the hardest hit, particularly with regard to access to sexual and reproductive health and rights services, and an increase in gender-based violence. To safeguard the demographic dividend from the impact of COVID-19, governments will need to come up with strategic and evidence-based short and long-term recovery strategies. Key policy recommendations that were made through the webinar series were that the post-COVID-19 recovery and reconstruction plans need to be informed and sustained by evidence of population dynamics. Recovery plans and post-COVID-19 measures must, for example, be youth-centered and address emerging priorities that are intensified during the pandemic, such as sexual and gender-based violence, substance abuse, and mental health. It is imperative that we also invest in data and measurement to inform both short-term and long-term responses to COVID-19 and similar disasters that may occur in the future. It will allow us to build on our data analysis and understanding of the pandemic and lessons from across Africa and the world. So, Chairperson and colleagues, it has now become abundantly clear that the vulnerable groups require special attention in our collective response to COVID-19, as they've been disproportionately affected. And often the responses in place against the pandemic do not adequately address their needs. This means that if countries are not careful, the crisis will further widen pre-existing inequalities. Vulnerable groups will need targeted interventions that include the following, amongst others. On the sexual and reproductive health and rights front, young girls have to be protected from dropping out of school, as this is likely to contribute to teenage pregnancies and early child marriages, and will curtail their future potential. Women have been exposed to increased sexual and gender-based violence during this period, and measures need to be put in place to protect and support them. Interventions that have used digital platforms, including digital learning platforms, have clearly illustrated the digital divide and gender inequalities that will need to be addressed for such interventions to actually work. The loss of employment has disproportionately affected the poor, as well as youth and women in particular. These groups are more likely to be employed in low-earning informal sector jobs with no social and legal protection measures. Governments and the private sector have to invest in reviving these sectors. So to conclude, Chairperson, support for these proposed interventions can best be mobilized by collecting, analyzing, advocating, and sharing evidence-based policymaking. The PPD is very well placed to collect and disseminate such evidence and to facilitate South-South and triangular cooperation to incubate innovative new ways of making the social investments that will promote and safeguard the well-being of vulnerable groups beyond the coronavirus crisis. This should also be extended to documenting and sharing lessons on best practices to overcome COVID-19 among countries and regions. Thank you very much.